Welcome to the NDE's Nutrition Services training for the USDA's Supply Chain Assistance Funds. I'm Katie Parch, Director of the Child Nutrition Programs at NDE, and I'm joined today by Jenna Hilligoss, as well as a few other members of the school meals team. Jenna will help present information about SCA funds with me today. And before we get started, I wanted to emphasize that the funds are intended to provide immediate financial relief and to offer needed support to the work that you continue to do to meet students' nutritional needs each day. As we share more information and address some common questions and concerns about the funds, please keep in mind that these funds aren't intended to add burden to you during an already demanding time. So if you go to the next slide, Jenna, I'll cover a couple of basic housekeeping things to keep in mind for today. And while Jenna and I share slides, just try to make sure that you mute your microphone in order to avoid that sometimes disruptive feedback that we know can happen in Zoom meetings. You can keep your camera on or leave it turned off. It's totally your choice. And feel free to type questions that you think of into the Zoom chat, or you can unmute your microphone at the conclusion of the presentation to ask about things you think of while we share slides and information. And we have dedicated some time at the conclusion of the presentation today so that you have an opportunity to ask questions about things we might not cover explicitly as we share information. So let's get started, and you can head to that overview or agenda slide, Jenna. Today's SCA funds training will cover some basic information about the funds and the eligibility requirements to receive them, as well as how funding calculations were completed to determine the amount that each school is eligible to receive. Then we'll cover the process for accepting or declining the funds, as well as some key dates and deadlines you need to be aware of. And finally, we'll look at the record-keeping requirements for schools that choose to accept SCA funds. And then we'll follow that up with some frequently asked questions before giving you all a little bit of time to ask questions of your own. So Jenna, I'll hand it over to you. Go ahead and get us started with some of that basic information about supply chain assistance.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks to all for joining this afternoon. We wanted to first provide just a little bit of information on what supply chain assistance or SCA funds are. You'll see the acronym SCA on your screen now throughout the presentation, and then in follow-up communication when we say SCA, that's the supply chain assistance funds. And these funds are being made available to the school food authorities that are participating in the National School Lunch Program and or those that are participating in the school breakfast program. And the real intent of these funds is to provide that immediate, like Katie said, assistance to support school districts as they navigate supply chain issues, increased food costs, and other challenges related to food service at your schools. You'll note here that these funds have a very exclusive and single purpose, and that is to provide funding for unprocessed and minimally processed domestic foods. We'll have a slide later in the presentation that breaks down what purchases would fall into the acceptable and unacceptable category, and can certainly talk about other unique examples of food purchases you might be curious about related to these funds. We also wanted to provide a link here to USDA policy on supply chain assistance funds released on the 17th of December of 2021. And this link here will take you to the memo issued by USDA and also provide some other resources USDA has compiled in the expenditure of these funds at both the state agency and local level. So again, who is eligible to receive SCA funding? As we just talked about, it's school food authorities that participate in the school lunch and or school breakfast program. We've outlined the funding process into 3 simple steps, as you'll see here. State agency, us, Nebraska Department of Education, receives an allocation of SCA funds. The next step is that we ask the school food authorities to provide an attestation statement if that school food authority would like to accept full or partial funds that are being offered. And then the third step is NDE distributes those funds to school food authorities that accept them based on the FNS guidance. And this is really kind of a simplified version of how SCA fund distribution will look like over these coming months. There are two levels of funding calculations that have been done to determine how large of a funding amount each SFA in Nebraska will receive. And it really starts at the state agency. So here at NDE, we have received about $1.5 million to distribute to local level school food authorities for the purchase of those unprocessed or minimally processed domestic foods. And it's really a focus here at NDE that we distribute these funds to you, to the local level authorities as quickly as we can, as we know these are urgent and immediate concerns and food supply issues that you're dealing with right now. The second level is local level funding calculations. And so this slide outlines how the amount determinations were made for each local level SFA that might decide to collect these SCA funds that are being made available to you. And so here again, schools participating in school lunch or breakfast programs are eligible to receive these funds. And there's a predetermined formula that has two components that will determine what amount of funds your school is able to receive. The first component is a $5,000 per school allotment, and that has no relation to school enrollment or any other factors. Each school is awarded that base amount of $5,000. Added to that $5,000 to get your total will be additional funds that are based on the number of students in schools that participate in the school meals program. And so that number is really focused on student enrollment within your school district from the 2020-2021 school year. You'll see on this last bullet out as well, we wanted to be transparent that this data is coming from October 2021. That's when we're collecting that enrollment level data, and that is what was used to determine the local level funding and entered into that predetermined formula. As I've mentioned already here in the presentation, SFAs are given the option to accept or decline funds, and as a result, there is the possibility that a fund reallocation process might be followed. And so if the SCA funds for School Food Authority are either accepted in part or are declined, a secondary distribution might allow schools to receive the reallocated funds. It's our intent at NDE to fully distribute the $1.5 million that we've been allocated. And so it's possible that if other SFAs decline or only select to take part of their funding amount, that reallocation efforts would be completed. You'll see here the reallocation must be finalized by September 30th of 2023, though it's certainly our intent to have a deadline not so far away, but it certainly depends on the acceptance of funds and how quickly we can move through reallocation efforts. And certainly any additional information that we have related to the timeline of reallocation, additional funds that your SFA might be eligible to receive will be communicated with you as soon as we're able. Here again, certainly wanting to focus on each SFA's option to accept or decline funds. All SFAs that are eligible to receive these funds will receive a Qualtrics survey link that is going to be distributed via email. You'll see that link show up in your email sometime later this week. The initial email with the link is going to be sent to the authorized representative as listed on your current school lunch program application. And follow-up emails related to reminders or any further communication about SCA will also include the claim contact to ensure anyone who is making these decisions about fund allocation is included in the notification process. Again, SFAs are able to accept or decline funds, and fund acceptance can either be in full or a partial amount of the allotment dedicated to your SFA. If an SFA is accepting any amount of funds, the attestation statement must be signed in order for those funds to be deposited into your account. we have made or included that attestation statement as part of the survey that you'll be completing. And so when you have a complete survey, that also means that you've completed this required statement for us. The survey must be completed by March 1st, and we'll provide reminders to those that might need it, based on the results that we see for completion within the Qualtrics survey. We did want to provide some dates and deadlines, both short-term and long-term, so you kind of have an idea of what the process of fund allocation and use of the funds looks like. You'll see here on the left side of your screen, we're starting with the survey submission again. We ask that you submit that by March 1st and include that attestation statement signature if you'll be accepting any amount of funds. If you are declining the funds, we still ask that you complete the survey to let us know that, but you will not be required to complete the statement piece. Fund distribution, we intend to have all funds distributed by March 15th of 2022. And you will see those funds directly deposited into the nonprofit food service account set up for your school through the CNP and E1 systems. Reallocation efforts, you'll see listed here again. We intend to have that process not just beginning, but additionally wrapped up and completed by September 30th of 2023. And we'll provide notification to SFAs on updates related to reallocation efforts and additional amounts that you might be able to accept as part of your SCA total funding package. And then lastly, usage of the funds. And we'll dive into this certainly more throughout the presentation, but one request we make is that you retain purchasing records for the funds that you use and expend. And we also ask that you use these funds as quickly as possible. We'll dive in here to more of the acceptable and unacceptable purchases. But based on our review of what you can use for these funds, we anticipate that this money will be able to be spent quickly because it's on a lot of food products that you likely are purchasing in great frequently and very frequently to complete your food service every day. Okay, and the use of funds. So on this slide, you will see two different columns, one on the left that outlines acceptable purchases and one on the right that focuses on unacceptable purchases. This is not a totally inclusive list, but more meant to give you a good idea of how these funds can be used and kind of break down some of the common foods that you might be purchasing or making and understanding how you can use these funds to supplement that work. So here again, SCA funds must be used exclusively for the purchase of unprocessed or minimally processed domestic foods. Here on the left side under acceptable purchases, you'll see dairy products, fluid milk, cheese, and yogurt, fruits and vegetables, which also includes 100% juices, grain products that are minimally processed, examples being pastas, rice, flours, meats, either whole pieces or ground meat, and then lastly, meat alternative, beans and legumes, certainly with a focus on the minimally processed requirement. And then on the right side, you'll see unacceptable purchases and you'll see a pattern here. These are highly processed foods that would not qualify for the use of SCA funds. Pre-made pizzas, as an example, breads, muffins, crackers, pre-packaged sandwiches or meals, chicken nuggets, and then lastly, cereal. And we do really want to emphasize and focus on the requirement of these funds to be used for these food products, but also that anything that's being purchased with these SCA funds must align with the meal pattern requirements that are in place at the time of purchase. So kind of as an example, items that might be allowed now as part of the meal pattern with the use of waivers might change when we head into the next school year, 22-23, when the transitional meal pattern requirements will be in effect. So the focus is really on the date of purchase and what meal pattern requirements were in place on that specific date. I'll go to the next slide and then I'm going to hand it back to Katie to talk a little bit about procurement and then record keeping related to these funds.
Thank you, Jenna. And so the basics surrounding procurement and record keeping for the use of the SCA funds is identical to what your normal purchasing practices and documentation are with your traditional or typical reimbursement that you get from the meals that you serve to students each month. You're going to follow those usual procurement requirements. There has been a suggestion or an encouragement to purchase locally when possible, but that is not a requirement of the funds you receive. As you would with other purchases used or made from the nonprofit school food service account, retain those purchase and other related records for a period of 4 years. And then you would provide documentation to us regarding what items were purchased using SCA funds to NDE only if we ask you to. And most commonly, that's going to be during an administrative and or procurement review. So an example to really illustrate that this is not intended to be an additional burden to you. You don't need to make a separate line item to document all the purchases made with SCA funds, right? You just receive, for example, $7,500 in SCA money. Then you would be able to produce for us $7,500 in invoices that document that unprocessed or minimally processed domestic food items were purchased and then therefore served in the school meals program, breakfast, lunch, and or after school snack. So simple as that. Hopefully that makes it sound a little bit less intimidating than it may have when you heard initially, oh, more money comes with additional things to do. Again, that's not the intent of these funds. It's really meant to provide you with needed support right now. So you could head to the next slide, Jenna. Yep, so SFAs with food service management companies providing their school food service can use the SCA funds to pay for invoices they receive from the management company operating their food service. Obviously, the SFA would do its due diligence to ensure that the management company has purchased unprocessed or minimally processed domestic food items used in the meals that are provided to students at the school. And so the SFA and the management company can work out the documentation that they want to be able to share and exchange or receive from the management company to ensure that money they have used to pay the monthly invoice for the number of meals that the management company serve to students, includes foods purchased that are minimally processed. So like Jenna shared a couple of slides ago, this should be pretty easy to do. Every meal requires milk, fruits, and vegetables, and those are all examples of perfectly acceptable food purchases. So the management company is purchasing those items, serving them in the meals to students, should be able to produce for you invoices that show what they purchased and how much was spent, and therefore your SCA funds can be used to pay those invoices for the number of meals served to students. If we head to the next slide, we'll see a similar situation or example provided related to SFAs that have vendor agreements, probably with other SFAs. So again, School 1 can utilize its SCA funds to pay for meals provided by school number 2. So again, that SFA that has the vendor agreement that receives the SCA funds to spend is going to ensure that meals provided by the vendor school contain or provide those necessary unprocessed or minimally processed domestic food items. The school that's serving as the vendor would be able to produce invoices that document that they purchased milk, fruits, vegetables, and other minimally processed items. And therefore, the school that receives meals and pays the invoice to the other school would safely be able to utilize SCA funds to pay for a portion or all of those a full invoice over the course of, a year or two, a month or two, as long as the school providing the meals is able to document what they purchased and that it's minimally processed. Make sure, however, that those SFAs that purchase if an SFA wants to purchase additional allowable food items that are outside of a contract, that the contract allows that to take place. For example, I think if we go to the next slide, Jenna, it will help me illustrate. An SFA can accept the funds and then use those funds to add a breakfast that their vendor school might not provide, or maybe add an after-school snack that they participate in through the child nutrition programs, also not part of what they normally receive from the vendor school. As long as the agreement allows this additional thing to take place, then the school that receives the funds can use the SCA dollars to pay for the food items used in those additional meals or snacks that are not provided by the vendor school. Excuse me. And that might be an option to use in a situation where an SFA gives over all of its reimbursement each month to another school that serves as its vendor, where the original school that has the agreement with an additional school to provide meals also doesn't do any of the administrative work in the school meals program. Therefore, they have no food purchases for meals and have no staff time to pay for out of the nonprofit food service account. I mean, it seems like they have no cost to the program, but they have this additional funds they could potentially accept. One way to spend those funds is to add a meal or snack, as long as that's allowable within the agreement that those two SFAs have. You could head to the next slide, Jenna. Let's take a look at some frequently asked questions or common questions we've been getting since the announcement of SCA funds was made. Can food products purchased with those funds be served at any time? Well, the answer to that is no. And as Jenna said very early in the presentation, the supply chain assistance funds can be used only to support the service of meals through national school lunch and breakfast programs. This year, most schools are operating it through the Seamless Summer Option or NSLP After School Snack. Schools that participate in the Fresh Fruit Vegetable Program cannot use SCA funds to purchase food items used in the FFVP. If you head to the next slide, Jenna. We want to answer whether funds can be used on labor, supplies, or any administrative expenses related to the school meals program. And as you probably know, the emphasis and the requirement is on purchasing food items that are minimally processed. So the answer to this one is no. But incidental costs that are part of a purchase price for those allowable food items are allowable. So, you know, a shipping cost, handling, packaging, anything like that comes kind of with the receipt of allowable food items are also allowable costs. And we'll head to the next slide, Jenna, for another FAQ. Do you have to track those SCA funds separately from your nonprofit school food service account? And the answer to that is no. Right? You're going to put the SCA funds you receive into your school food service account. You would maintain documentation of how those SCA funds were used to purchase allowable items. In real life, IRL, that one at the bottom there, in real life, what does this mean? It means that if your school received $10,500 in SCA funds, you would just need to be able to show me, if I ever asked you, that you purchased $10,500 in minimally processed food items at any point in time after having received the funds. So again, no separate line items, no additional accounts, nothing like that. This money becomes part of your nonprofit food service account, and you would just show us that you made allowable purchase up to the amount that you were awarded and received. Let's look at another FAQ. And are you required to accept the funds? And the answer to that is no. You definitely have the right to decline this additional funding if you do not believe it's needed to support your school meals. If you don't accept your allocation, those funds will become available for reallocation to other schools at a later point in time. And Jenna mentioned that earlier. Additional information would be released about reallocation of funds as well. Let's take a look at one more frequently asked question, right? Well, can you accept those funds if your school has net cash resources? And of course, if you have that, you have received a letter from our office indicating that you need to submit a plan to spend down those funds. And the answer to this question really is yes, right? Maybe you have been intentionally saving funds in your kind of over time accumulating a balance because you have a big purchase you'd like to make, and that is part of your net cash resource spend down plan. You know that you need some big piece of equipment to keep your food service going. You can use your net cash resources to purchase that and Just because you have a balance there that you need to spend down and submit the plan for doesn't preclude you from accepting these funds. You can still take these funds, right? So again, your eligibility for the additional supply chain assistance money is not impacted by having received a net cash resource letter. Next slide, Jenna. Yep, maybe you did that. My eyes are kind of crossing today. Let's see, can your school accept less than its full SCA allocation? And the answer to that is yes. Jenna mentioned that you'll receive a survey in which you would accept or decline the funds. And one of the options for accepting is either to accept the full amount that's available to you that you're eligible to receive, or to note for us a lesser amount that you prefer to receive, and that is the award that you would be given. And what is the deadline to use those funds? Again, Jenna shared this in a timeline on one of the slides she presented. Ideally, the funds should be used within 2 years, reiterating that the intent is to use them as soon as possible because they have been allocated to you in order to address supply chain and pricing issues with school menu items. Again, we don't think it's going to be extraordinarily problematic to use up these funds to find ways to use them on allowable products. You have the rest of this school year and next school year. Ideally, 2 years is what we're going for, and I don't think anyone will have a problem utilizing the funds on those menu items they serve every day within that timeline. And this is an opportunity for you to unmute if you want to ask questions of us while you've got us here with our undivided attention. I know there have been quite a few questions coming through the chat as well. So Jenna, have you been kind of keeping track of that and want to catch us up on the ones that have maybe already been asked and answered?
Yeah, certainly. And I think there's one we could maybe address right now too. Let's see, Johnny asked, can the funds be used for purchases made from earlier? Oh, and my screen just changed. Here we go. Can the funds be used for purchases made from earlier in the school year, or does that start from the time that money is received?
Hi, Mr. Ehlers. I believe that the guidance on that, which we will post to the website so you can read those FAQs and additional like supplementary questions and answers, indicates that the purchases made with SCA funds need to happen after those funds have hit your nonprofit food service account. So the invoices should be dated after March 15th, which is our intended disbursement date.
Great, thank you, Katie. Another question that came in earlier that we responded to was from Jerry, and she said that they are a K-12 system that has 2 sites, and she's wondering if they would receive $5,000 per site or as one system. And I responded that, you know, funding is determined based on the entire school system or school district, and so the base $5,000 amount is provided to each school system, and then additional funding based on enrollment within that entire school district. And the funding amounts aren't impacted at all by the number of sites that each SFA is currently operating right now. Let's see, and Amy has also asked here about allocation being based on free and reduced numbers.
And we did not utilize that information or data as a way to determine funding allocations for each school or SFA. Instead, we chose to offer funding dependent really only on total school enrollment. So you could sort of think of it as the $5,000 base value per district, like Jenna mentioned, plus like a per student dollar amount, dependent on enrollment numbers in that school.
Thanks, Katie. Mary has asked, when will we know the amount of funding for our district? And the funding amount will be included in the survey link sent to each authorized representative later this week. So keep an eye out and you'll see within that survey that the allocation amount specific to your SFA will be listed. And again, you can either elect to accept all of those funds or accept a partial amount or decline the funds based on what works best for you in your SFA. Gail has asked a question here too. What happens if you accept the funds but don't use them all within the 2-year period?
Yeah, good question, Gail. I'm sure others have that same one. And my response to that is I truly don't think it would be problematic for you to utilize the funding allocation within that time frame, just because, again, all meals are served with milk and fruits and vegetables, and those are just so common in the meals program, and those are allowable purchases. I guess the other thing I would say on that is, like Jenna mentioned, when you receive the survey, it's going to identify the funding amount you're eligible to receive. You could take a look at that value, compare it, or just assess it related to how much you spend on milk in the school year, or fruits and vegetables in addition to milk, for example. And you'd be able to make a pretty educated guess on whether or not you think you'd have to be able to utilize those funds in 2 years. Again, no penalty or anything like that. We're going to continue to encourage schools to remember to document how they're using those funds. And I really don't think anybody's going to have a problem doing that. So I guess keep us posted. If you've got questions after you look at the amount and want to talk about it one-on-one, we can certainly do that too, Gail.
And this is also related kind of to that question. Walt Hill has asked maybe some of the reasons that a school might decide to decline the funding. Katie, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, Walt Hill, yeah, great question there. I think that maybe if you are on the net cash resource list and have potentially struggled to identify a spend down plan and haven't really been able to identify any high cost needs that are going to help you be able to spend that money down, that might be a consideration you make. However, with spend down plans, there isn't a defined deadline by which all net cash resource funds have to be expended, and it's not terribly uncommon for schools to continually have to reassess how they're serving meals or operating their meals program. And one of the things I want to emphasize with these SCA funds, as well as schools that have net cash resource funds, is that really the focus of the program is on providing highly nutritious meals to students. And we know that higher food quality tends to cost more. So as a dietitian, of course, I'm going to encourage everybody to accept the funds, because it's going to help give your school food service account some stability financially. It might help reduce the amount of general funds that your school usually has to supplement in the account, right? If you're taking these funds to pay for food items used in meals, you have already existing school food service account funds that can be continued to use to pay staff working in the meals program. Might be able to be used to purchase equipment that you know your kitchen needs. And that equipment might be totally necessary, an oven, for example, which is so integral to making meals, but it might also be able to be used to purchase something that makes your cafeteria a little bit more student friendly, items that might encourage those students to, or might encourage you to be able to offer a wider variety of food items that are going to be very appealing to students. So on the dietitian side, and just knowing we want to give kids access to as many healthy and appealing foods as we can, I encourage everybody to accept the funds for that reason. And it frees up other money that's already in your nonprofit food service account, so you can use it for other priorities you might identify in the program.
Okay, thanks, Katie. We have had a few other questions come in that are related to specific questions about a purchase being acceptable or unacceptable. And so, I think we would do our best to respond to each of those today, but also might require taking some of these back and getting additional guidance ourselves. But Katie, I'll let you know some of the products that people have asked a question about. A question about fresh fruits and vegetables that are purchased as commodities. That's the first product question.
I feel like I should remember this from the Q&A, and I feel like the answer is no. But we'll write down all the questions we get that we're unable to answer today, in addition to some that we probably have answered, and we'll release an FAQ document along with the recording of this training and the PowerPoint that Jenna and I shared. So I don't feel comfortable answering that one today because I don't want to give a wrong answer, but look for that answer in documents we release in a couple of days. It's a good one.
Perfect. Another good one here asking about using the funds for pre-cut USA fruits and vegetables.
pre-cut, canned, even juice, right? Which we know you could call it processing from a whole fruit or vegetable to make a juice. Yeah, those things are all acceptable purchases with the funds.
Oh, and this is an interesting one too. Use of the SEA funds for butchering a cow.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one, but we will certainly find one and make sure we post it in our Q&A document following this training.
David had a couple other examples here. He asked about eggs being eligible for purchase, and then also if the fruit and vegetables would need to be fresh in order to be included as part of SEA funds.
Yeah, good question. Those fruits and veggies can be fresh, frozen, canned, or juice as a form of those. So that's okay. And you asked about eggs, and yeah, I would put eggs in like the meat alternate meat alternate category, where there really isn't anything done to the egg. It's not made into some part of a breakfast sandwich, for example. So those would also be allowable purchases with the funds.
Okay, and then the last specific example I'm seeing right now is related to whole grain rich products. And Amy, she specified the purchase of buns or pasta that are whole grain rich.
Yeah. Pasta certainly would be an allowable purchase with the funds. Buns, I don't recall if those were explicitly identified as an allowable cost, but I think it's in the Q&A document. So we'll make sure to find that and answer that question in our written response to the questions we received today. So that's a good one, Amy. Thank you.
And then one last one for acceptable versus non-acceptable. Kelly just asked about seeds. I believe at her school, they are looking to start their own garden. And so she's wondering if the purchase of seeds would be an acceptable use of the funds.
Yeah, good question. And the answer to that is no. We want these to be, food items you can use here and now. But the fact that you're getting SCA funds to purchase those minimally processed food items means that it might have freed up some already existing funds in your school food service account. And with those normal, in quotes, set of funds, purchasing seeds to grow items in school gardens that get used in school meals are certainly allowable costs.
Okay.
I know answers sometimes sorry, Jenna, kind of make it sound overly complicated. We're not intending that. I just feel like I have to say that again. Purchase milk, fruits, and veggies, meats, unprocessed or minimally processed grain items, and I think you'll be able to use up this money in almost no time at all.
Thanks, Katie. There's two other questions here related to receipts, and I think this kind of piggybacks on what you're saying with the desire for this to be a simple and request on schools that doesn't require additional time and processing. Candace asked about if there's any other paperwork that is necessary rather than just keeping receipt for purchases and holding on to those daily production records. Is there anything else that would be required? And Donna specifically asked if those receipts would need to be separate with these food products that are acceptable purchases. Would that need to be kept separate from other items?
Right. No, great questions, and gives me another chance to say no. And this is not intended to be additional burden or record keeping or tracking for you. The only time you'd maybe need to dig those out is if, like I said before, we were completing an administrative and or procurement review, perhaps, which, we've got a 5-year cycle. We're working on those. And we would just ask you for, you received $5,600 in supply chain assistance funds. Can you show me $5,600 worth of receipts for minimally processed items since March 15th, 2022? Making sure that you're using those funds to purchase foods for the school meals program. So if you're a school that also participates in the SFSP, and of course you purchase fruits, vegetables, and milk for summer meals, you can't use the SCA funds to cover the invoices for foods purchased in the summer meals program, right? You would use up a little bit at the end of this school year here. Then you'd sort of like pause your tracking on that, or, documenting how you're spending down the SCA money you received. And then you'd resume it when school starts up again in August for school year 22-23. So I wanted to make sure, I don't think we said that in the slides. I know I certainly didn't mention it and should have. You just want to, like, there would be a pause if you're a a summer meals participant and resume sort of tracking your spend down. You could do it in a spreadsheet or some way that, you know, you're just making sure that if we asked questions, you'd be able to give us the documentation or supporting information we needed. But we are not asking you to track it really any separately or have a separate tracking mechanism or procedure in place. So again, not intended to be more burdensome to you.
Thanks, Katie. A few questions have come in that are related to if a certain school food authority qualifies for SCA funds. And I think that perhaps, I think Henry, you're the one to ask that question. Maybe if you could stay on at the conclusion of the presentation today and we could talk individually about the youth shelter, if they would be included and be able to be receiving any of these funds. I also see a request about an individual school and providing some funding information that they've received in the past. I think we want to highlight that this is a new funding opportunity that has not been offered in previous years. And so we can certainly provide, you know, any previous kind of special, like the emergency funding that some folks received. But this SCA funding opportunity is new to this school year. I also see a question in here about when will we know what amount you've received. And again, keep an eye out for that email with your survey link. And that survey is going to outline exactly the funding amount that your SFA is eligible to receive. An additional question here from Mary, and Mary Watson, she's asking if the funds can be used to pay for meals that are being purchased from another school.
Mary, yeah, answer is definitely yes. You can use the funds to pay those bills or invoices you receive from meals, the meals you receive from another school. Your question just highlighted that I think I did a pretty terrible job of trying to explain that in the slides. A short answer is certainly yes. You would want to make sure that the school from which you receive the meals and the bill, right, because they're providing it, therefore they're doing the purchasing of menu items that would need to be minimally or unprocessed, that they could share with you documentation to support that they in fact did purchase those minimally processed or unprocessed domestic food items that were also in fact used to provide meals to the students in your school. So you would communicate with that other SFA to determine what kind of documentation you feel comfortable to receive from them to verify that the money you're giving them out of your SCA pot, so to speak, you know, is allowable use of those funds. So as you kind of mull that over, discuss it with the other SFA that provides your meals, you're certainly welcome to submit questions to us so that you feel comfortable about the kind of documentation and records you're retaining, so that when we do an administrative or procurement review, you feel comfortable that you'd be able to provide to us the things we need to document proper use of the funds. And right below Mary, Jenna, I know you're tracking this really well. Sue asked a question. I wasn't sure if you saw that one.
Yes, so should funds be deposited using our current NDE federal revenue code, or will NDE be providing us a new revenue code specific for these SCA funds?
Yeah, great question, Sue. I imagine others are asking it too. The answer to that is no, there isn't a separate revenue code that will need to be used for these. Again, the SCA funds become part of your nonprofit school food service account. So, you know, we don't want to overly complicate it or add another thing. So that's not something that would need to be done, and we won't give a different code for these dollars.
Okay, thank you, Katie. This next question, it was presented by staff, and so I'm not exactly sure which SFA is asking about this, but the question was, will we fill out a separate survey for each school that we provide meals to? And I think that relates back to, you know, Katie, the question you were just answering about a school that has vended meals. The survey and the acceptance of funds is related to the purchase of minimally processed or unprocessed food products that are served at your School Food Authority. And so you will be responding to that survey based on the food service that you provide. But just like Katie said, having, communication between your SFA, and if you are provided meals by another SFA, open communication there on the documentation and the process, and whether acceptance of funds would be a benefit, for your school food authority is obviously a good conversation to have. But in the survey, we're asking specifically about your SFA, not so much the SFAs that you might vend or provide food products to. Let's see, a question here. Do you have to have a certain number of kids? We are a smaller school. And so that's where we talked about that $5,000 base amount is going to be allocated to every single SFA regardless of enrollment. Additional funds on top of that $5,000 amount are going to be allocated based on student enrollment. And kind of like Katie said, it's a predetermined formula, that is determined per student and funding per student. And so everyone has access to the $5,000. And then when you receive that survey, you'll see what additional funds are being allocated to your school district based on student enrollment numbers from the 2021 school year. Donna asked who will be sending the email with the survey. And so that will come from my email address, and it will be through the Qualtrics survey system. And so again, that will be sent out to authorized representatives sometime later this week. As soon as we're able to send that out, we will do so. Okay, let's see here. Go back. Oh, Kylie asked a good question here. Is there going to be a list of example items provided for each category that are allowable? I know, we intend to post this live webinar and also a copy of the slides to our website. The USDA policy memo site for SCA funds would also be a great resource. Katie, any other thoughts or feedback on a list of allowable items based on, I'm guessing this is meal pattern categories?
Yeah, I agree with you. The table that you created for the slides that you shared early on in the presentation would be something we could possibly expand on, especially now knowing some of the specific questions that folks asked. So we'll try to get those represented in the table that we release with other resources in a couple of days.
Okay. So Lauren, let's see, Lauren on our team, she said a question was posed directly to her, so she wanted to share a response so that everyone would know. May districts turn in a Highland statement for several months that meet the allocation, or do they need to provide individual receipts for those dairy product purchases?
I think that a statement that includes several months worth of purchases reflected on it that would obviously document exactly what was purchased. I'm guessing it's just fluid milk in this case, but that seems like a reasonable way to document purchase of allowable items. It doesn't need to be individualized, maybe by week or month might have been the implication in part of that question. But yeah, kind of a combined, I guess, statement that reflects several months is also fine, as long as the months reflected or the time period reflected in this combined sort of statement occurs after the school has received the supply chain assistance funds. Okay. I'm doing a double check here to make sure that we addressed all of the questions here in the chat. And again, if you had a specific question about your school food authority's ability to receive these funds, you could either stay on here at the end of the presentation, or you'll see the nde.ns web email address listed on the screen. If you have individual questions about your eligibility, please let us know and we can kind of handle those on a one-on-one basis. Amy asked, when will we know the amount of funds that we qualify for? Keep an eye on your email for the survey link that's going to be sent out to those authorized representatives. That survey link and the actual kind of the first page of the survey will have your SFA name listed along with the amount that you are able to either accept in full
partially accept or decline. So keep an eye out for that survey, and that will provide the answer to your question there, Amy. Let's see, any other questions that we haven't addressed, or any other thoughts right now that anyone might have?
I'm also trying to go through that list of questions in the chat, Jen. I really do think you got them all covered. But we do record the questions posed in the chat, and it gets dumped into a document for us. So we'll make sure to comb through these. If one of yours or one you asked didn't happen to get answered today, and of course we know there are a few that I declined to answer right now on the hot seat, we'll make sure we get them in writing. And like I said, posted with the slides that you saw today, including a recording of this in case you want to go back and watch it later or share it with someone else at your school, in addition to some of the written resources we think will be valuable to you. So look for that in the coming days, along with what Jenna said, making sure in the next day or two you keep your eyes peeled for the survey. And if you don't see it in your inbox, give your junk mail a check too. It might be sitting there, that's possible. And if you don't receive it and think you should have, certainly reach out to Jenna utilizing the email address you see on the pink slide here. Of course, we'd like to know if it didn't reach you, and we can resend it to you in case a technological glitch could have happened. Dana asked a good question. Do you need to put your email address in the chat for sending out the slides? And I'm gonna not bother you all with that today. We have a contact list we generate from the C&P system where you complete your online application, and we pull email addresses out of there to make our distribution list. So if you receive emails from me, including the one about this training, you'll definitely receive the slides and link to the recording from today as well.
There's one other question that's popped up here, Katie, and I think we have time to address this still here. A question about how does this money work for food management companies that are in school systems? And more specifically, does the food management company turn receipts into the school and they just reimburse the food management company?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know Sean is here listening, so she can help me on this one, I think. You wouldn't reimburse the management company if the agreement is one where you pay a per meal price or fixed price. And I think 95% of schools in Nebraska with management companies doing food service have that kind of agreement. You would just utilize SCA funds to pay for a portion of your monthly invoice from the management company, as long as that management company could provide to you invoices or receipts that demonstrate they purchased those minimally or unprocessed domestic food items that were also served in your school meals program, breakfast, lunch, or possibly after school snack. And Sean wrote an answer in there. Yeah, so you can't just hand over additional funds to the management company. They couldn't give you a receipt or an invoice specific to milk for, say, $552, and you give them an additional $552 out of like your SCA funds, right? You have that contract in place, charged per meal you serve to student, depending, the price, of course, depending on the meal type. That's your agreement. You have to stick with that. You pay them only according to what that agreement says. However, the SCA funds can be used to pay a portion of that monthly per meal served invoice that you receive from the management company, as long as they can give you documentation that says they purchased allowable items used in the meals served to your students. I know that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around, especially if you're me. I had to roll that around for about 5 days in my head to really feel like comfortable and okay with how that would be implemented. So as you consider that, maybe have conversations with management company staff at your school, see what they're hearing from their leadership as well about how to deal with this. Keep in mind, you want to work within the parameters of your written agreement. You don't want to go outside of your contract. And if you've got questions as you proceed forward to figure out what kind of documentation you need and how to utilize this money, don't hesitate to reach out to us. That's definitely what we're here for. We want to help you feel comfortable to receive and utilize the funds appropriately. We want every school in Nebraska to benefit from this needed support, and however we can help you do that is what we're here to do.
I'm not seeing any additional questions here in the chat, Katie.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we'll get to work on compiling these questions and getting some answers to you all for the ones we were unable to answer today. Of course, I want to thank Jenna and every member of the school meals team at NDE for the extraordinary support that they provide to each of you every day. And, I'm here in equal amount of gratitude for all of the work that each of you do. We know that serving meals the last 2 years has been an extraordinarily difficult task, and you stayed in there, you've been doing it. We appreciate it. I've got a kid in school, and most of the school meals team has the same. Like, we've got kids in school. We understand what a really wonderful benefit these meals are to their school day. And we know their school day wouldn't be as good as it is if it weren't for people like you doing this work. So we want to say thank you for joining today, and thank you for all you do. And look for information to come out from us in the coming days. Thanks so much.